But for those who don't like it, will be finished relatively soon. So I hate to say that about any part of Torah, but it is actually it is important. But I understand that different strokes for different folks, as they say. Okay, so we looked at the first few Middos. We looked at Kal V'chomer. We looked at Gezerah Shava. And then the last two things we looked at is Binyan Av Mikosov Echad and Binyan Av Mishnei Kisuvim. And Binyan Av is the same as what the Gemara calls a Ma'motzinu, and it is simply a midah that is called reasoning by analogy. If the Torah gives you a certain din in one case, we will say that it also applies in other cases that are analogous. So if the Torah says a law by a shore, it will also apply to a horse and a chamor and everything else. Now, Binyan Av is reasoning by analogy. Lahavdil, those of you that have any type of legal training, know that that is really the essence of what precedent is, in which you draw analogies from an existing case to other cases. And that's what a Binyan Av is. Now, a Binyan Av Mikosov Echad simply means I look at case A and I say the law applies to case B, C, D, and E. However, the problem is this. Binyan Av, unlike Gezerah Shava, is a logical analogy. It's not based on the words being the same. It's based on the idea being the same. Mimela, on a Binyan Av, you can always ask what is called a pircha. Pircha literally means something that breaks it, and that simply means a logical refutation. You want to say, just like A is so-and-so, B will be the same thing, but no, there's a difference between A and B because A has a certain characteristic. This is similar, but not identical, to what you would do with a Kal V'chomer, in which you think from the Kal I go to the Chomer. No, what you think is the Kal is really Chomer. Binyan Av doesn't have to be Kal and Chomer, but it is a logical reason to distinguish case A from case B. And when there's a pircha, that gets rid of your Binyan Av. In other words, you can't draw an analogy if the cases are not analogous. Right? That's the very thing. If the cases are different, logically, I don't mean you couldn't use as a pircha. If I want to extrapolate from a case involving a shore to a case involving a chamor, I can't say, oh no, that's a shore and this is a chamor. I mean, analogy does mean you're expanding the cases. So a pircha does have to be a logical distinction, right? That A and B are not the same because. So at that point, you don't have a Binyan Av, and you cannot extend it from A to B. But coming to the rescue is the next midah, which is called Binyan Av Mishnei Kisuvim. That would mean that the Torah gives you a certain halacha in case A, and the Torah gives you the same halacha in case B. And case A has a certain characteristic that is not shared by case B, and case B has a certain characteristic that is not shared by case A. Now, I'm trying to learn out to case C, so I can't learn out from A because A has a certain characteristic. But B does not have that characteristic. I can't learn out of case B because B has a certain characteristic, but A does not. So in other words, Binyan Av Mishnei Kisuvim is a way of diffusing the pircha that would otherwise exist by showing that pircha is not, or that logical distinction is not relevant to creating the halacha. You can't say A is different because of something, because B doesn't have that something. And you can't say that B is different because of that something, because A doesn't have that something. So A shows you that B's distinction is not relevant, and B shows you that A's distinction is not relevant. So we then try to find a common denominator between A and B, which can then allow me to include C, D, E, and F that share the common denominator. So the need for a binyan av mishnei kesuvim is when the ma'amatzinu, or the binyan av, that's the same thing, would have a pircha that would prevent me from learning. This is something that's very, very common in the Gemaras that deal with drashas. A lot of Gemaras you're learning are not drasha Gemaras, so you're not going to have it. But any sugya that deals with drashas almost invariably will wind up in what is called Hatzad Hashaveh Shebahem. Hatzad Hashaveh Shebahem is finding a common denominator in order to make a binyan av mishnei kesuvim. Now again, it's a little tricky because the Gemara will not always quote the midah. It won't say, this is a binyan av mishnei kesuvim. In other words, if you're going to ask me, where does the Gemara describe binyan av mishnei kesuvim, it kind of never describes it. It just does it. But whenever you see the words Hatzad Hashaveh Shebahem, that is doing a binyan av mishnei kesuvim, and then the Gemara will get into a secondary discussion. Well, how do you know the common denominator is such and such, which will include C, D, and E? Maybe the common denominator is something else that will not include C, D, and E. Because, again, once you find the common denominator, there might be different common denominators that you could find, right? There might be different commonalities, and that will affect what you're going to include. If you take one common denominator, you'll include certain cases. If you take another common denominator, you will include other cases. So that's a shakla v'tarya. That will be a discussion what the common denominator is. Now, again, you understand that by definition, this part of Torah Shebaal Peh is not transmitting laws from Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai. They are using logical processes to create common denominators, and they will debate what is the common denominator. This is drasha. This is not halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and that's why there's going to be a machlokas about that. Any questions about what binyan av and mikasav echad, binyan av mishnei kesuvim, Hatzad Hashaveh Shebahem is, and then the shakla v'tarya, what maybe there's another tzad hashaveh, another common denominator. So essentially, binyan av is reasoning by analogy, which can be refuted by showing dissimilarity, but the dissimilarity might be rendered irrelevant by showing another case without that dissimilarity, where the halacha still applies, and then that allows the binyan av to be made. Okay, so that takes us through 4. Now, the next 4 rules, the next 5 rules deal with the category called klal uprat in various manifestations. Klal uprat. So klal uprat is where the Torah, in one case, this is not different cases, in a single case will give a generality followed by specifics. So it will say the following. When a person steals an object, an ox, a sheep, a garment. So the word object is called a klal. It's a general rule, a general term, which by definition would include everything. But then you have specific examples. Animal, sheep, ox, garment. Klal uprat. And you have many cases where the Torah starts off with a general term and then gives specifics. Sometimes the general is before the specific. Sometimes the specific is before the general. If the general is before the specific, it is called klal uprat. When the specific is before the general, it is called prat uklal. And these are respectively the 5th and the 6th midah. There is a midah called klal uprat, and there is a midah that's called prat uklal. And which midah you will apply depends on how the pasuk is written. If it's written with the klal first, it's a klal uprat. If it's written with the prat first, it's a prat uklal. So here, now what's interesting is, the list of Middos actually doesn't tell you what you do with it. It just says, right? The fifth Middah says there's a Middah called Klalu Prat, and there's a Middah called Pratu Klal. Okay, that's wonderful. Well, what do you do with it? What does it mean? So it doesn't really tell you. You have to go back to the Teres Kayanim itself and look at the examples. So it's not clear. But what the Middah is the following. When you have a Klal and a Prat, Ein Bichlal Ella Masha Befrat. So let's say the Torah would say the following. If you steal an object, and in English we would put a colon, an animal, or an ox, a sheep, or a garment, you must pay. Now, if you only had it as a klal ufrat, we'll see that we don't have it that way, we would say that the prat actually tells me that you should ignore the generalization. And the only thing that the halacha applies to are the three examples. There is nothing in the klal other than the prat. The prat is the only thing that matters. Now, you may ask a kasha on this. So if the klal is totally ignored, and I only follow the prat, why did the Torah write a klal? Just write the prat. The answer is very simple. If it would have written the prat, I would have made a mamatzinu to other things. Right? If the Torah stamazai gives you pratim, that's mamatzinu, that's binyanav. I can derive analogous cases from a list of pratim. In other words, a list of pratim is not exclusionary, b'etzem. A list of pratim can be expanded by binyanav, at least if there's no pircha. So, klal uprat is essentially the Torah telling you, do not make a binyan of. That the halacha only applies to these specific cases. I mean, you hear this. If it just would have given me the specifics, that wouldn't have excluded everything else. I could have made a binyan of. But when there's a klal followed by a prat, the Torah is telling me, don't expand it beyond these cases. That is when you have a klal and a followed by pratim. Either prat could either be a single prat or a number of pratim. It makes no difference if it's one prat or 10 pratim. It only applies to the 1 or the 10, whatever it is. Now, the sixth midah is the opposite. Prat uchlal. So an example would be, again, I don't have the psukim in front of me. Let's say the Torah would say, again, I'm really making up these examples. If you steal a sheep, an ox, a garment, all objects. So the klal is after the prat. Then we say exactly the opposite. We include everything. That the prat is just illustrative, we include everything. Of course, there you do have a question. If the Torah wanted to include everything, why mention the prat at all? Just mention a klal. Say, if you steal anything. So that's a good question, really. Meaning, bishlama, by klalu prat, there's a reason to mention the klal, because that negates binyanav. But by a prat and a klal, where you include everything, and the prat has no limiting functions at all, so why mention the prat? I don't know, that's a bit of a tzorichi, and there's no reason to mention the prat in the midah of prat to klal. Right, so everyone understands klalu prat, prat to klal. We then come to the seventh midah, and that is klal uprat uklal. And this is actually most of the Gemaras that discuss the klal uprat middos are actually focused on this, klal ufrat uchlal. And that is where the Torah starts off with a generalization. It moves to a specific, either one example or 5 examples, and then it has a generalization. So an example would be, if you steal an object, ox, sheep, garment, or any object. So there's a klal and a klal bracketed in the middle, which brackets a bunch of pratim. So you can't call it a klal uprat because there's also a klal after the prat. You can't call it a prat uklal because there's a klal before the prat. So the Midah says the following. Because it's a prat and a klal, you're marbe other things, but because it's a klal uprat, you're mamayet other things. So how do you reconcile this? They're moving in opposite directions. The answer is your marbe things that are called ke'ein haprat. Your marbe things that share a common denominator with the details. This is similar to what you do with binyan av mishnei kesuvim, in which you try to find a common denominator between case A and case B. So here, when you have a list of pratim, you find a common denominator amongst the pratim, and there may be a debate in the Gemara what that common denominator is, and your marbe, not everything like you would do had it been a prat uklal, but your marbe things that are ke'ein. Ke'ein means resembling the prat. Klal, ufrat, uchlal. Your marbe ke'ein haprat. Again, it's very similar. Ke'ein haprat is very similar, different words, to tzad hashava. Tzad hashava is the language that we use for mamatzinu and binyan av mishnei kesuvim, and ke'ein haprat is what we use in the midah of klal ufrat uchlal, but l'chayra it is the same construct of finding a common denominator between a list of things. Okay, that's ke'ein haprat. Okay, so that is klal ufrat uchlal, your marbe ke'ein haprat. Yeah.
So the example of a ke'ein haprat?
No, so a good example would be actually Geneva is actually a very good example. In the parsha of Geneva, the Torah says if you steal something, then it mentions an ox, a sheep, a garment, or other things. You're chayav kefil, you got to pay double. Now because it's klal ufrat uchlal, we look for a common denominator between ox and sheep and garment, and essentially the Gemara's drasha is that it has to be what is called gufo mamon. It has to be something that is intrinsically worth money, and this would exclude something like a shtar. Let's assume somebody has a promissory note, an IOU. Now an IOU, the piece of paper is worth less than a penny. It's valuable only because you can collect with it, but it itself is not worth anything. So if I steal an IOU, I don't pay kefil on it, right? That would be an example, because your marbe, every object that has value, you are mamayet something that's not gufo mammon, because in the parsha of Geneva, it is actually a klal ufrat uchlal. Okay, so you look at a common denominator. Now if it just would have said, right, listen, if it just would have said, if you steal a sheep or an ox, I would have said the common denominator, it has to be an animal. And if I steal a computer, I don't pay kefil. But by putting in garments, that creates a new common denominator that goes beyond animals and includes anything that is gufo mammon. Okay? So that's an example of a klal ufrat uchlal, which is ke'ein haprat. Okay? And again, as I say, that is fundamentally the same thing as looking for a common denominator in a binyan av mishnei kesuvim. Now, here I want to bring in something that apparently there is a machlokes how to apply this midah, and it goes by two different names. The name that Rabbi Yishmael gives the midah is klal ufrat uchlal. That is what Rabbi Yishmael calls it. Other mandiyamrim, other tanaim, give this midah a different name, but it's not just a different name, it's a slightly different methodology, and they call it riboy, miut, riboy. Right? Riboy is inclusion, miut is exclusion, and riboy is inclusion. So you'll find the Gemara will say one Mandi Amar, one Tana darshans with the midah of klal ufrat uchlal, and the other Mandi Amar darshans with the midah of riboy, miut, riboy. Very, very common. Again, in drasha Gemaras, a lot of Shas is not drasha Gemaras, but in drasha Gemaras, you will be hit with this many, many times. What's the difference? It's not just a matter of name, and that wouldn't be that important. One calls it by one name. Rather, the methodology is this. When you darshan klal ufrat uchlal, Ke'ein Aprat says you're only going to be marbe those things that share a common denominator with all four pratim, and let's say four, whatever the number is, and anything that does not share the common denominator is not going to be included. With riboy, miyat, and riboy, the way it works is this. You're marbe everything, but each prat excludes one thing. So, an example would be this. If you have a klal, and you have pratim, and you have a klal. So if you apply the methodology of klal ufrat uchlal, the only things you will include are things that share a common denominator with the enumerated pratim. If you go with the world of riboy, miyat, v'riboy, you will be marbe everything, but you will only exclude four things from your list, or whatever the number of pratim there is, and obviously you will exclude the four things that are least similar. So you'll include many things that may not share a common denominator, but they have some similarity. You will have to choose the ones that are least similar, so each prat is a miyut of only one thing. To put it another way, to put it operationally, riboy, miyut, and riboy is more inclusive than klal ufrat uchlal. Because klal ufrat uchlal will only allow you to be marbe those things that share a common denominator with all four. Riboy, miyat, v'riboy will include everything except the things that are least similar, in which each prat is excluding one thing only. And if there are four pratim, you're going to exclude four things. Okay? Now, one question you might ask, and it is a good question, is, well, wait a second here. L'chaira, I've said many times, that even though the actual making of the drasha is not a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, Hashem gave it to the Sanhedrin to make drashas, but the middos of drasha, right, the middos, the methodology of drasha, was given to Moshe Sinai. Hashem gave us the interpretive keys by which the Sanhedrin looks at the Chumash. Right? It was given at Kal V'chomer, Gezei Reshava, the midah of binyanav, the ability to make analogy. So how could there be a machlokas if klal ufrat uchlal is ke'ein aprat, or I apply riboy, miyat, v'riboy, which is a different methodology? It's a different methodology, right? How could that be? I mean, if the midah was given to Moshe Sinai, and the midah was handed down, on that, how could there be a machlokas? That would be a machlokas on what is one of the middos, right? So how do you understand a machlokas tanoim if you do klal ufrat uchlal or you do riboy, miyut, and riboy? So the answer has to be this. The answer has to be that when the Rambam makes the statement that there's never a machlokas on a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, right? That's the Rambam statement. How could there be a machlokas on halacha l'Moshe Sinai? It was handed down, and once we start talking about mistakes in transmission, that undermines everything. The Rambam just means there'll never be a machlokas in which one person says there is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and the other person says no. However, there can be a machlokas how to interpret a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The same way there could be a machlokas how to interpret a pasuk, there might be a machlokas how to interpret. So here is the thing. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai said that when you have a generalization, followed by detail, followed by a generalization, you are supposed to include things beyond the details. That is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But there can be a machlokas if the way you do it is ka'ein haprat, or the way you do it is riboy miyat for riboy. In other words, that's both opinions are using the generalization front and back as an instrument of greater inclusion, but they are differing as to the degree of that greater inclusion, you see? So that is a legitimate question, even within the parameters of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. In other words, the Rambam doesn't mean there can't be an argument about how to apply a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. He just means there's no machlokas is. And so if somebody were to say, there is no such midah as including things based on generalization, detailed generalization, so that wouldn't be possible. We know there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you are marbe things beyond the pratim when you have a generalization and a generalization with pratim in the middle. But the machlokas is the methodology, you're marbe everything, and you use the pratim for specific exclusions, which is riboy miyat riboy, or you're marbe only those things that share a common denominator with all four of the all four of the details, or whatever number of details. Okay? So it's interesting that riboy miyat for riboy does not appear in Rabbi Yishmael's list, for a very simple reason. He applied the midah by the name klal ufrad uchlal. But there are Tanoim that call this midah riboy miyat riboy, and they will have different halachic conclusions that they will draw based on that drasha. Yeah.
So I know the Rav said in the beginning of this whole thing that there are some other Tanoim that have a list that's obviously longer or shorter.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, so that's really not such a situation. Maybe I'll bring in Hillel's list. Hillel, who was the earliest person, Hillel was earlier than Rabbi Yishmael, only had 7 middos. But the Meforshim point out that in Hillel's 7 middos you have Rabbi Yishmael. So for example, Hillel has something called klal uprat. So the Meforshim say when Hillel called it klal uprat, he meant all of the klal uprat things that Rabbi Yishmael said. He meant klal uprat, he meant pradu klal, he meant klal ufrad uchlal. In other words, he subsumed them under general categories, but you can subdivide them. So Rabbi Yishmael subdivided it, Hillel didn't subdivide it. But in substance, in other words, Hashem didn't say it as a number. Hashem didn't say there are 13 principles. Hashem gave us the keys, but you can count them in different ways. You can count them in more general groups, you can count them in specific groups. So there are different countings, but fundamentally they all include the same things, but there will be machlokim how to apply it, like klal ufrad uchlal or riboy miyat for riboy. So they say Hillel's 7 were simply explained by Rabbi Yishmael as being subdivided into 13 altogether. By the way, there's a beautiful, I can't tell you the word because I have to go through it, but in Kabbalah there's a beautiful kesher between the 13 midas of Rabbi Yishmael and the 13 midas of Rachamim that come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? We're going to read about the Yud Gimel midas this week, right? Hashem, Kel Rachum V'chanan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu teaches Moshe these midas of Rachamim after the Cedar Egel, and he tells Moshe Rabbeinu that when Klal Yisrael sins and they do these midas, I'll talk about do these midas. It's an interesting point. The Shalah says, I will have rachamim. The Shalah HaKadosh says, by the way, very interesting thing, that even though the pashtus of the Gemara is when we say these midas, but the Gemara's lashon is when we do the Seder of the midas. The Shalah says the yikar is to emulate the midas of rachamim of Hashem. That brings the rachamim. It's not just the amira. Right? Kishiyasu banecha kiseder hazeh. But these are the famous Yud Gimel midas of Rachamim that are so important. Slichos, right? After every slicha. Actually, it's interesting. I want to correct just as an aside. We're not doing slichos now, obviously, but I just said a statement. After every slicha, we say the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim, because that's the way we kind of look at it. I say these kapitel, I say the piyut, and then I say Kel Melech, and I say Hashem Hashem. So all of us look at, including me, all of us look at the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim as the conclusion of the slichas. Actually, that's not the way it is. It's actually the beginning of the next slicha. Every slicha begins with Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim and then a piyut. Now, that's not the way that's not the way you instinctively look at it. But the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim is not the end of the slicha. It's the beginning of the next one. So, that's a little something just to be aware of when you look at the Cedar. Okay, but be it as it may, the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim are so important that you can only say them with a minyan. They're Kadesh. Sfardim say the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim every day before Tachanan. That's part of the Tachanan. Both Shachris and Mincha. If you are Ashkenazi and you're davening in a Sephardic minyan, you should say the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim. Don't pass it up. It's a good opportunity to be Mavakesh Rachamim. All of us can use Rachamim. So that's Pashut. We all know this. But the Chiddush of the Mekubalim is that the abstract principles of Rabbi Yishmael, how to interpret the Torah, are mechuvan keneged the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim. So, for example, the first midah of Rabbi Yishmael is Kal V'chaimer. Kal V'chaimer is connected to the first Hashem in Hashem Hashem. Gizei Reshava is the next one. Now, how that is so, maybe actually might be an interesting thing. I'll try to go over it. I mean, it's a very complicated thing, but maybe that might be a kind of an agada to break from the halachic discussion of the Yud Gimel Midah. So I can take my authorization from the Gemara itself. Like the Rishonim say that one of the reasons why there's agadata is because sometimes the halachic discussions got too difficult. Agadata was designed to give us a little relaxation of thinking about a different topic. So that might be a nice segue to be makasher at least some of the Yud Gimel Midas of Rabbi Yishmael to the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim. But there is a connection. Every single midah of interpretation of the Torah is connected to the midos of Rachamim of Hashem, and the getter is that limud of Torah Shabbal Peh brings Rachamim to the world. Right? In other words, your Isaac in Torah Shabbal Peh, that itself is ma'orer, the highest levels of Rachamim. In fact, it's brought down. This is also a well-known halacha that many, based on the Arizal, many people have a minhag. Again, among the Litvisha, we don't follow it so much, but Sfardim and Hasidim, they will not learn Torah Shebechsav at night. They will not learn Chumash at night. They will not learn Tanakh at night. They will only learn Torah Shabbal Peh. In fact, they won't even say Tehillim at night, because Tehillim is Tanakh. And by the way, the Arizal says that only applies until Chatzais. Once it's midnight, it's an Eitz Ratzain, and that's already the beginning of the next day. So after Chatzais, there's no problem. And Friday night, there's no problem, because all of Shabbos is called light. So the problem of Torah Shabbal Peh does not apply Friday night, and it does not apply after Chatzais. But before Chatzais, some people are machmir. And the svara is like this. The svara is that Torah Shebechsav Kabbalistically represents Midas Hadin, strict justice. Eye for an eye, right? Ayin tachas ayin. The Chumash literally can be very, very strict. Ayin tachas ayin. Torah Shabbal Peh represents the Midah of Rachamim. Now, night itself, the power of din is very strong. There's no or, right? So the Midas Hadin is miskaber at night. So you don't want to learn Torah Shebechsav at night, because you're taking something that's Midas Hadin and you're learning it in Midas Hadin, so you may be intensifying the din in an overly powerful way, and therefore, Al Pi Kabbalah, the Midas Hadin is not, you don't want to trigger it at night, so that's why some people do not learn Torah Shebechsav. Again, as I say, among the Litvisha world, we're not so machmer, and the emes is, the truth of the matter is, this is one of those halachas that can be easily circumvented, because if you're learning Chumash and you learn Rashi even, So that's already Torah Shebal Peh. In other words, you can kind of get around it by making your Torah Shebichsav Torah Shebal Peh. And Le'idach Gisa, if you're doing Tehillim, they say, oh, that's not learning, that's Tefillah. So there are different ways in which you can get around it. But nevertheless, there is such a core idea that Torah Shebichsav is Rachamim, is Din. Torah Shebal Peh is Rachamim. And that ties in exactly with the idea that the Yud Gimel Middos of Torah Shebal Peh are connected the Yud Gimel Middos of Rachamim that we're going to read in Parshas Ki Sisa. Okay, we'll stop here.